Hey everyone, we're working hard to get our first 1,000 subscribers, sign up and you won't regret it. I used to think the most expensive thing in a marriage was the wedding. Turns out it's the moment you realize the person you trusted is trying to leave you with the bill. It started on a Tuesday night that felt like every other Tuesday. Same leftovers. Same muted TV in the background. Same distance between us on the couch that had grown wide enough to fit an entire other life. My wife, Savannah, didn't look at me when she said it. She stared at a spot on the wall like she'd rehearsed it there. She wanted a divorce. Not the kind with yelling or plates shattering. Not even tears. Just a sentence dropped carefully onto the coffee table, like paperwork. I remember nodding like my body was trying to buy time for my brain. Then she added the part that made it feel reasonable. Almost responsible. She said we couldn't afford attorneys. Said she'd been reading about DIY divorces. Said it was straightforward if we kept it amicable. Said we were adults. And I believed her because I wanted to. Because believing her meant the end could be clean. It meant there wasn't something darker underneath, something I'd have to name. I'd been laid off 6 months earlier. I was back to work, but not at the level I used to be. I'd gone from managing a team to doing contract logistics for a medical supplier. It paid the bills. It didn't restore pride. Savannah had always been ambitious, but lately it wasn't ambition. It was impatience. Like she was standing in a line that moved too slowly, and I was the person in front of her with too many coupons. So when she said she'd print the forms and we'd file together at the county courthouse, I said okay. That's what I did a lot in the last year. I said okay. Over the next few weeks, she became productive. Too productive. She organized documents with an energy she hadn't used on us in a long time. She pushed for speed. She talked about moving on like it was a healthy lifestyle choice. I asked simple questions, the kind you ask when your life is turning into a stack of papers. What about the house? What about the credit cards? What about our savings? Savannah answered in the same calm tone every time, the way a customer service rep handles someone who is emotional but not important. She suggested we keep it simple. She suggested we split what we had and stop nickel-and-diming each other. She suggested I didn't need to make it complicated. And I almost didn't. The thing about betrayal is that it rarely announces itself. It hints. It leaves fingerprints. It changes the air in a room. Like her phone, suddenly always face down. Like late work dinners she didn't invite me to, even when she used to. Like the way she started calling our house the place, as if she was already somewhere else. I tried to make peace with it. I told myself people change. I told myself not everyone leaves with fireworks. I told myself I'd rather lose a marriage than lose my dignity. Then one afternoon, I picked up our mail and saw something that didn't belong. A letter from a bank I didn't recognize, addressed to Savannah. Not a statement. Something thicker. Official. The kind that isn't sent unless there's something new to celebrate or something old to collect. I didn't open it. I didn't even touch it longer than I had to. I just stared at the return address like it might blink first. That night, she was in the shower, and her laptop sat open on the kitchen counter. Savannah was careful with her phone, but she treated her laptop like furniture. A browser tab was pulled up. A calendar. A courthouse address. A time slot. And another tab beneath it, one I wouldn't have noticed if the page didn't have a bold heading that made my stomach tighten. It was a draft of a separation agreement. Not the generic one from the county website. This looked structured. Personalized. Like it had been built by someone who knew what they were doing. I didn't scroll far. I didn't need to. I saw my name. I saw language about debts and exclusive use of the marital residence. I saw numbers next to assets that didn't match our reality. And I saw a line that hit like a cold hand on the back of my neck, a reference to a business interest tied to Savannah. A business interest. We didn't have a business. Unless she did. I sat there listening to the shower run, realizing I wasn't reading divorce paperwork. I was reading a plan. The next day, I took a long lunch and went to the county clerk's office alone. I told myself I was just checking procedure. Just verifying steps. Just being responsible. The clerk was polite, tired, and fast. She answered in the tone of someone who had seen 1,000 versions of people trying to pretend they were fine. I asked what gets filed and when. I asked if anything had already been filed. She typed, paused, then asked me to confirm the address. Then she said something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. A preliminary petition had already been submitted. Not finalized. But started. And the filer wasn't both of us. It was Savannah. I left the clerk's office with my hands shaking in my pockets, trying to decide what hurt more, that she'd moved forward without me, or that she'd done it while insisting we were doing it together. That evening, I didn't confront her. I didn't want her to close ranks. I didn't want her to get better at lying. Instead, I did something I'd never done in our entire relationship. I looked at her like a stranger. And I asked myself a question that had never mattered before. Who was helping her? Because Savannah was smart, but she wasn't careful. This was careful. This was someone else's fingerprints. 2 nights later, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, sliding printed forms toward me like she was handing me a menu. She pointed to signature lines. Suggested we file on Friday morning. Said it would be quick. I watched her hands. I watched the calm. I watched the way she didn't look me in the eyes when she said we didn't need lawyers. And I realized she wasn't trying to save money. She was trying to save me from noticing. So I agreed. I told her Friday worked. Then I went into the garage, sat in my car with the doors closed, and searched every word I'd seen in that draft agreement until I found what it was tied to. The phrase wasn't random. It belonged to a template used by a local family law firm. A firm that didn't advertise cheap. A firm that didn't write DIY agreements. I stared at the firm's name on my phone screen for a long time. Then I recognized it. Because the last time I'd heard it, it wasn't about divorce. It was about my job. It was the firm used by Dawson and Klein, my old employer, whenever they needed something handled quietly. Severance packages. NDAs. Internal resolutions. And suddenly, the betrayal wasn't just personal. It was connected to the part of my life Savannah always said wasn't good enough anymore. Friday morning came fast. We drove to the courthouse in the same car, sitting 2 feet apart like coworkers headed to a meeting. Savannah looked light. Like she'd already dropped something heavy and was enjoying the relief. I tried to keep my face neutral, my breathing steady. In the lobby, she checked us in like she'd done it before. Like she'd rehearsed every step. We sat on a bench outside the courtroom. Couples around us were either angry or devastated or numb. Savannah was none of those. She was almost impatient. Then the door opened, and a clerk called our case. We stood. We walked inside. And that's when I saw him. Not the judge. Not the clerk. A man sitting at a table near the front, in a suit that fit too perfectly for county court. Older than me by at least a decade. Confident posture. Calm face. The kind of calm that comes from knowing you're protected. He turned when we entered, and he smiled at Savannah like they shared a private joke. I knew him. Not personally. But I knew the type. He was the kind of man who shook your hand while deciding what you were worth. Savannah's DIY divorce had a professional spectator. And when he stood, he said his first words, quiet, controlled, meant for the room to hear. He introduced himself as counsel. Not for Savannah. For something else. Something that made my blood go cold. Because he didn't say he was here for my wife. He said he was here to ensure compliance with an agreement already in place. And I realized I wasn't just walking into a divorce. I was walking into a trap that had been set long before I ever signed anything. The courtroom had that tired smell, old wood, old carpet, old decisions. People think courtrooms are dramatic because of movies. Real courtrooms are worse. They're normal. Like life, but with microphones. Savannah sat down like she belonged there. I sat down like I'd accidentally walked into the wrong room and was too embarrassed to leave. The man in the fitted suit placed a thin folder on the table in front of him. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look curious. He looked like he was waiting for a bus. I kept my eyes forward, but my peripheral vision kept returning to him the way your eyes return to a bruise you don't want to touch. The judge came in, everyone stood, everyone sat. Our case was called. We approached the front. Savannah moved a half step ahead of me. It was a tiny gesture, but it said everything. She was leading. I was following. The judge asked if we were representing ourselves. Savannah answered, yes, amicably. Then the judge's eyes moved to the suited man. He introduced himself again, more formally this time. Not as Savannah's attorney. He said he was appearing in a limited capacity on behalf of a third party. The judge's expression changed, just slightly. The judge asked what third party. The man said the name like it was nothing. Dawson and Klein. My old company. The room didn't spin, but my stomach did. The judge asked why my former employer was relevant to my divorce. And the suited man did something subtle. He angled his body just enough that he could look at Savannah without appearing to. Then he said there was a binding agreement connected to marital assets and disclosure requirements. He said the court should be aware before any final judgment, to prevent fraudulent transfers. Fraudulent transfers. Like I was hiding money in a shoebox. Savannah's face stayed smooth. But her fingers tightened around the papers she'd brought. I realized she'd known he would be here. I realized she'd invited him. My head filled with questions so loud I barely heard the judge ask if I understood what was being raised. I told the judge I didn't. Because I didn't. The suited man asked permission to hand up a document. The judge allowed it. He placed the paper in front of the judge like an offering. Then he turned and offered a copy to me. The page had my name on it. And Savannah's. It was an agreement I'd never seen. It looked like a contract tied to a severance package. The kind that comes with legal language and deadlines and consequences. The kind you sign when you're desperate to keep the lights on. The signature line at the bottom had my name. And next to it, a signature that looked like mine. Looked like it. But wasn't. I stared at it, my brain refusing the obvious. The judge asked if I had signed this. I said no. My voice came out rough, like I hadn't used it in a while. Savannah finally looked at me. Not with sympathy. With calculation. Like she was measuring whether I was about to explode in a way that would benefit her. The judge asked Savannah if she recognized the agreement. Savannah said yes. Not yes, I recognize it. Yes, it exists. Yes, it's real. Yes, it's part of this. The suited man added that the agreement had been executed during my termination. He referenced a payout amount. He referenced stock options. He referenced a confidentiality clause. Stock options. I didn't have stock options. Or at least, I didn't think I did. When I was laid off, the company gave me a severance check and a standard release. No stock. No special perks. Nothing worth bringing lawyers into family court. Unless there was something I never knew. Or something Savannah knew. The judge's eyes narrowed. The judge asked me if I'd ever received additional compensation from my former employer. I said no. The suited man didn't argue. He just opened his folder and pulled out another sheet. A bank transfer confirmation. A deposit into an account. An account number I didn't recognize. But the name at the top was familiar. Savannah's name. The judge asked Savannah what that was. Savannah's mask slipped, not fully, but enough that I saw the tension underneath. She said it was unrelated to the divorce. The judge didn't buy that. The judge asked whether Savannah had received money connected to my employment separation. Savannah tried to keep her voice steady. She said the money was from consulting work. She said it wasn't marital. The suited man calmly corrected her. He said the funds were tied to a settlement agreement with Dawson and Klein. He said the company was asserting that the settlement required strict confidentiality and restricted disclosure because it involved internal misconduct. Internal misconduct. I felt my skin go cold. I hadn't committed misconduct. But someone had. Someone inside the company. And somehow Savannah was in the middle of it. The judge asked to see the full agreement. The suited man said he had it. Savannah's eyes darted to him, then back to me. And for a fraction of a second, I saw it. Fear. Not fear of losing me. Fear of losing control. The judge called a recess to review documents. Everyone stood. Everyone murmured. People filed out. Savannah moved fast. She grabbed my elbow, guiding me toward the hallway like we were still a team. Once we were out of earshot, she dropped her voice and told me we needed to keep calm. She told me not to make a scene. She told me this was all a misunderstanding. And I stood there staring at her, hearing nothing but one thought repeating like a warning. She had money I didn't know about. She had paperwork I didn't sign. She had my former employer's lawyer in our divorce. This wasn't about leaving me. This was about using me. I pulled my arm away and walked toward the men's room just to breathe. In the mirror, my face looked older than it had 2 hours ago. My phone buzzed. A notification from my email. A new message had come in, one I almost ignored because my hands were shaking. The subject line was short. It had my old employee ID number in it. And the sender was a name I hadn't seen since the layoff. Graham Rudd, Director of Compliance. The email was 1 sentence long. It said he was sorry, but he couldn't let this go any further without telling me the truth. And attached to it was a PDF titled, Internal Investigation Summary, Confidential. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot because I couldn't open that email in the hallway. I didn't want Savannah near me when I read it. I didn't want her face, her breathing, her little sighs of impatience. I needed silence. I needed the truth without her editing it in real time. The PDF was longer than I expected, and that alone scared me. A summary, that's 30 pages isn't a summary. It's a controlled explosion. I scrolled. I skimmed headings. There were dates that matched the months before my layoff. There were references to shipments, vendor bids, compliance flags. My stomach tightened when I saw my department's name. Logistics. My job. And then I saw it, a section labeled Third-Party Communications. Savannah's name was in it. Not once. Not as a bystander. As a participant. According to the report, Dawson and Klein had been under investigation for steering contracts to a specific vendor in exchange for kickbacks. The kickbacks weren't cash under the table, they were disguised as consulting fees paid to relatives and spouses of employees who had access to bid information. Spouses. Savannah. The report included an email address I recognized instantly, Savannah's old personal email, the one she'd used for years. There were messages summarized, not quoted. Dates. Times. Attachments. One line describing a spreadsheet called Pricing Guidance. A spreadsheet that sounded like bid rigging with nicer formatting. My chest felt tight. I had to take a breath and force my hands to stop shaking long enough to keep reading. Then I hit the part that made everything click into place so hard it hurt. Dawson and Klein had identified a leak. Someone feeding vendor info out of the company. They started tracing it back. My name became a convenient cover. Not because I did it. Because I was in the right place on paper. I was the fall guy they could afford to lose. The report said investigators found evidence that Savannah had accessed my work laptop on multiple occasions, using a saved password. She'd downloaded files. She'd forwarded them to her email. She'd communicated with the vendor's contact. And when the company tightened security, she panicked. So she did what smart, ruthless people do when they see consequences coming. She moved first. The report described how, shortly before my layoff, Dawson and Klein offered a confidential settlement to an involved party to avoid public exposure. The involved party agreed to sign an NDA and release. In exchange, they'd receive a payout. That payout went to Savannah. Not to me. To Savannah. The company wanted her quiet. Savannah wanted money and a clean exit. They both needed someone else to take the blame. And I, apparently, was standing in the perfect spot. That's where the forged signature came in. The report indicated that the settlement agreement required a related employee acknowledgement. My name was used to legitimize the release. A signature that looked like mine was attached. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. I thought about every time Savannah had said we couldn't afford attorneys. I thought about how she'd pushed the DIY divorce like she was saving us. She wasn't saving us. She was trying to rush through a divorce before I found out she'd tied my identity to fraud. Because if I discovered it while still married, a lawyer could argue that her money was marital. That her wrongdoing could affect me. That the whole thing needed serious legal attention. But if she divorced me quickly, on paper, she could claim her consulting money was hers, not ours. She could claim her mess wasn't mine. And if the company got dragged into court, she could present herself as a divorced woman protecting her separate assets, not a spouse who used her husband's access. In other words, she was trying to cut the rope before the boat sank. My phone buzzed again. A text from Savannah. She asked where I was. She said the judge would call us back soon. I didn't reply. I called the number at the bottom of Graham Rudd's email. It rang twice before a tired voice answered. He sounded like a man who'd been carrying something ugly for too long and finally got permission to set it down. He told me he didn't know how far Savannah would push it. He told me the company's legal team had wanted to handle it quietly because public scandals cost more than settlements. He told me he'd objected. He told me he'd been overruled. And then he said the thing that turned my confusion into something sharper. He said there was more. Savannah hadn't just taken data. She'd left a trail framing me. A file copied onto my work laptop from her USB drive. An email drafted from my account then deleted. A calendar invite with a vendor that I'd never accepted. It wasn't just theft. It was an attempt to manufacture proof. And when the company needed a clean narrative, they used it. Layoff. Release. Quiet payout. Done. Except now there was a divorce, and the company's lawyer had shown up because Savannah was trying to move money and assets around. And if any of this became public in open court, Dawson and Klein couldn't control the story anymore. Graham told me something else, too. He said the vendor contact Savannah had been speaking to wasn't just some random salesman. It was Miles Carver. Not Miles like the band name list. I mean, that's what Graham said, but I'm not using that name here. Call him Carver. Carver wasn't just a vendor rep. He was Savannah's boyfriend. Compliance had photos. Messages. Proof of the meeting. Proof of travel. That bank letter I saw? It wasn't just a deposit. It was an account they shared. The call ended with Graham saying one more thing, quiet and almost apologetic. He said if I went back into court without counsel, I was going to get crushed. Because Savannah wasn't representing herself. She was using a DIY divorce to keep me unarmed while she brought weapons into the room. I sat there in the car, staring at the courthouse doors. My marriage was over, but that felt small now. This wasn't heartbreak. This was identity theft wearing a wedding ring. I finally texted Savannah back. I told her I needed time. I told her we weren't going back in until I understood what was happening. She replied instantly, anger breaking through the polished calm. She said I was being dramatic. She said I was trying to punish her. She said if I delayed, she'd make sure I regretted it. That last part made me oddly calm. Because threats only work when you still believe the other person is decent. I didn't. I walked back into the courthouse, not toward our courtroom, but toward the clerk's office. I filed a request to continue the hearing. I asked about emergency motions. And I did the one thing Savannah had been counting on me not doing. I asked for help. By the time Savannah realized I wasn't coming back to play along, the judge was already looking irritated. And the suited man from Dawson and Klein was already on his phone. I watched Savannah whisper something to him, her face tight, her confidence cracking at the edges. Then she looked across the room at me. And for the first time that day, I saw what she really was. Not heartbroken. Not conflicted. Cornered. The judge set a new date. The judge told us to return with counsel if third-party claims remained involved. Savannah stormed out first. I followed slower, letting space form between us like a boundary. In the lobby, she turned once, her eyes hard, and said something under her breath that wasn't meant to be heard by anyone else. I didn't need to hear it anyway. Because I already knew what she was thinking. She'd lost control of the timeline. And people like Savannah don't forgive that. Outside, the winter air hit my face like a slap. My phone buzzed again, this time from an unknown number. A single text. It said they needed to talk, urgently, before Savannah could clean up the rest. And it ended with a name I didn't recognize. Followed by 3 words that made my stomach drop. It said the sender was Carver's wife. I met her in a diner off the highway because that's where people go when they don't want to be seen choosing a side. She picked a booth with her back to the wall. She looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Not messy, just stretched thin, like her body was holding up a life that kept trying to collapse. Her name was Jolene. She didn't waste time. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't offer sympathy. She slid her phone across the table and told me to scroll. I did. There were messages, again, not quoted, but the pattern was obvious. Late-night plans. Hotel confirmations. Money transfers. References to the divorce date like it was a project deadline. Then I saw something that turned the whole story into something even uglier. There were messages about me. Not my feelings. Not my pain. My access. My password. My compliance idiot. There were jokes about how I'd be too embarrassed to get a lawyer because I didn't have money. There were lines about how Savannah could run him through the courthouse like a checkout lane. And then there was the message that explained Dawson and Klein's presence in my divorce. Carver had been panicking. The vendor was under pressure. The company was trying to seal things up. Savannah wanted her payout protected. Jolene showed me a message where Carver told Savannah the company would only pay if she signed the NDA and if my employee acknowledgement was attached. Savannah replied that she could handle my signature. That I was easy. That she'd seen me sign enough things to copy it. I sat there with my hands flat on the table, feeling strangely detached, like my body was waiting for my mind to catch up. Jolene told me she'd found out because Carver got sloppy. He left a second phone in his car. She found it. She didn't just see an affair, she saw a scheme. She said she'd contacted a lawyer first, but once she realized my name was involved, she wanted me to know before Savannah could rewrite the story. Then Jolene did something I didn't expect. She offered to help. Not out of kindness. Out of precision. Because Jolene wasn't interested in healing. She was interested in consequences. Here's what happened next, in the clearest order I can put it. I hired a real attorney. Not a billboard divorce guy. A family lawyer who also understood fraud and civil claims. We filed motions immediately. To pause proceedings, to preserve financial records, to compel disclosure. Jolene's attorney filed her own actions. Against Carver, including requests that forced discovery, meaning the truth couldn't stay in shadows. We alerted law enforcement and the court. Not with emotion. With documentation. The forged signature was the key. Forgery isn't a messy divorce issue. It's a crime. Savannah tried to go back to her calm act at first. She tried to frame me as unstable, bitter, controlling. But calm doesn't beat evidence. The next court date wasn't dramatic in a Hollywood way. It was worse for her, because it was procedural. My attorney presented the forged document issue. Presented the bank transfers. Presented the investigation summary. Presented a timeline. And suddenly Savannah wasn't the spouse, just trying to keep it simple. She was the person who had to answer why she received money tied to my employment separation. Why she had a settlement agreement that used my name. Why she pushed DIY filings while coordinating with a corporate lawyer. Why she had a relationship with a vendor tied to an internal misconduct investigation. Savannah's attorney finally appeared, because of course she had won. She'd had won the whole time, just not in the way she admitted. Dawson and Klein's suited man was there again, but his posture changed. Less confident. More cautious. Like he realized the quiet story wasn't staying quiet. The judge ordered financial disclosures. Full ones. Including that consulting account. Savannah's face went pale when the judge warned that failure to disclose could result in sanctions. The next few weeks were a chain reaction. The bank produced records. Deposits. Transfers. A shared account linked to Carver. Payments labeled as consulting that lined up with bid dates. My former employer, backed into a corner, did what corporations do when secrecy becomes risk. They stopped protecting Savannah. They produced more documents under subpoena. They tried to portray themselves as victims of two bad actors, Savannah and Carver. Maybe they were. Maybe they weren't. But the paper trail was too deep for them to pretend they hadn't benefited from keeping it quiet. Savannah tried to negotiate. Suddenly, she wanted privacy. Suddenly, she wanted to settle amicably. Suddenly, she suggested mediation. But the power had shifted. Because now she wasn't controlling the timeline. The wow twist, the part that felt unreal even while it was happening, came when my attorney uncovered something buried in the company documents. My layoff. It wasn't a standard layoff. My position had been flagged internally as compromised because of the manufactured trail Savannah created. Dawson and Klein didn't just let me go because of budget cuts. They let me go to eliminate a liability and close a story. And the severance package I thought was standard? The company had recorded it as part of a broader settlement strategy. They'd paid Savannah to stay quiet, used my name to paper it over, and then removed me from the building like a stain they could scrub out. I wasn't just collateral. I was the packaging. Once that was in the open, Dawson and Klein moved fast, not out of morality, but out of self-preservation. They offered a separate settlement to me. Not because they cared, but because I had leverage now. And for the first time since all this started, I felt something like justice settle into place, not as a rush, but as weight. Savannah's divorce strategy collapsed. The judge treated the hidden funds as subject to scrutiny. The court ordered freezes on certain accounts pending resolution. Savannah's credibility was shredded. Her DIY narrative was dead. Criminal investigators got involved because of the forged signature and the documented transfers. Carver flipped first. That's what my attorney said later. Carver tried to cut a deal, tried to paint Savannah as the mastermind. Savannah tried to paint Carver as the manipulator. Jolene watched it all with the calm of someone who had already mourned the person she married. My divorce, in the end, wasn't about splitting furniture. It was about separating my life from a woman who had used my name like a tool. The final hearing didn't end with a speech. It ended with orders. Savannah didn't get the clean exit she planned. The money she tried to hide became a spotlight. The timeline she tried to rush became the thing that trapped her. I walked out of the courthouse alone, but not ruined. Not confused. Not apologizing for taking up space. Because the most satisfying part wasn't revenge in the movie sense. It was the simple, earned reality that Savannah couldn't rewrite what she did once the paperwork belonged to the court. And later that night, when my phone buzzed again, it wasn't Savannah. It was my attorney. One line. He told me Dawson and Klein had agreed, formally, to amend the reason for my termination in their records and to provide a letter clearing me. It sounds small unless you've ever carried a lie that wasn't yours. I stared at that message for a long time, then put the phone down. For months, Savannah had tried to convince me we couldn't afford attorneys. She was right about one thing. We couldn't afford them. She just didn't realize I'd be the one who finally decided I couldn't afford her anymore.